around. And he liked Harry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, that's another thing about Harry. Was a very likable guy. You know, that's not obvious in Gilmore's book.
Did he take immediately to people, or did he size them up to figure out whether they were useful to him, or if he?
No, he was very quick. I met him at Gordon and Jacqueline's house at a party that Philip Blackburn took me to. And Gordon introduced me to him, and Harry started talking immediately about who he was and what he did, and invited me to come to the studio, which he had only gotten recently, I think with Gordon's help. And I went to see it, and I was totally floored, you know, because he was wonderful. He would go play the instruments for you just offhand, you know, and explain to you why and what. I never heard about microtonal. I never heard about 43 tones. I didn't understand what the untempered scale was. Nobody ever told me that they had tempered the scale in order to build keyboard instruments, which was Harry's story. And, you know, and he needed help.
And who were you at the time? What were you involved with?
I was a poet living in Marin. I was working as a public relations director and producer at KPFA, the first listener-sponsored station, because it was three poets, Lou Hill, who was the main guy, who was a poet and a friend, Richard Moore, myself, and you know, I had known them when they started the place, and eventually I went to work. And then I was in the jazz world, really, you know, knew a lot of people, but I grew up with classical music. My real mother's mother was a classical pianist, and she used to take me to operas and concerts. We came from Europe in the 30s. And so Harry explaining to me about his ideas of music and what he wanted to do and what he was up against, it was a challenge, you know. It was an enormous challenge, and I offered to help him, and he grabbed for it. And he was at the time working on plectrum percussion dances. He didn't have an ensemble, he had instruments. He had moved the instruments to that studio fairly recently. I was lucky enough to meet somebody who was involved with the Presidio band. That's the major orchestra for the military in the San Francisco Bay region, and it's right across the bridge from Sausalito. And I went about soliciting players, and they came in a rush, and Harry was flabbergasted. And he was into building new instruments. He had built the bass marimba. I think he'd had it for a while, but he was into this conundrum about his ideas for building a much lower register instrument, and he already had the name for it, the Eroica, and that turned me on. So we set about trying to figure out how to build it. And as I told you, I was lucky enough to have a friend who worked at the Navy Yard, Bill Loughborough, who we were living, he and his wife, and I and my wife, and our friend David Weed, a guitar and bass player, were living together in Mill Valley. an apartment, and he brought an audio oscillator and a oscilloscope, which of course Harry had never heard of or couldn't understand what they could do, because we had a major problem of building a resonator and providing a huge straight-grained fir block, which is not the block that's on this instrument now, by the way. Those are not the originals. But to couple the resonator to the block at 17 cycles per second for the big one, there were 3 of them at that time, but the big one was the real problem. And we managed to do it by various electronic and electromechanical means. I mean, the 3/4 plywood sides, they seem like they're rigid, but they're not really rigid. So we had to put threaded rods with butterfly and with washers, so we could compress the 4x8 by about 15-inch wide box together, and when you can actually hear the coupling, it's very obvious, and it's plus or minus is a very small increment, you know, and you can't hear it, but you can feel it. And our first indication at the studio was the windows rattled. You know, they rattled like hell, and we knew it was coupling. So we had to get a lot of old mattresses and 2x4s and nail mattresses. The windows were, I think, on 3 sides.
So this was the Gate 5 studio?
Yes, this was the Gate 5 studio. Gate 5 was the gate of the old Kaiser shipyards during the Second World War. That's where that whole Sausalito complex was, and this was one of the old shipyard administration buildings, and the landlord was a fairly nice guy. I can't remember his name, but I think Gordon knew him, and he was very friendly to Harry. He didn't get it. I mean, it's funny, you know, people who are into music very often refuse to understand what non-tempered scales are all about. And that was true of our landlord and a lot of the people, but Harry was very good at explaining why and how he had gone back to the Greek monochord, and how he had developed it from that onward. And I mean, to try and think about the monochord and then extend it all the way up to Kithara is not an easy job at all. And
so you knew him closely for about 4 years, and what kind of projects did you work on during that time? The Gate 5 Records and the Trust Fund?
Well, the Gate 5 Records was, he wanted to record plectrum percussion dances. It was the first project. And I said, how are we going to do that? And he said, well, he doesn't have any money, you know. I went to Gordon, and Gordon wasn't willing to give us very much, although he's willing to help. So I suggested to Harry that we somehow try and get subscriptions. Why did I do that? Because KPFA worked with subscriptions. It was the first station ever to do that. And I was the public relations manager, director there. I had gotten a thing going with a Japanese company called Granco, which made these tiny little tuners and FM sets. It was the beginning of FM. FM wasn't well known. We didn't have enough FM sets to support the station. So we made a deal to buy 100 at a time of these little receivers and tuners, and we sold them for very little along with a year's subscription. So extending that idea to Harry's recording was, and we asked for the money up front before we had the records made. You know, and I had friends from KPFA who recorded it for us, you know, so we didn't have to pay for a studio or anything, and it was done right in the studio. And we had no trouble selling out the whole first printing before we printed it and before we did the cover, and it just kind of went out very easily. And of course, and Harry was very satisfied. He was easy to satisfy as long as you went along with what his intentions were. And you know, soon after we did it, he was intent on redoing Oedipus. He, for some reason, the Mills College performance, which actually, according to some other people, had been quite a success, did not satisfy him at all. Sometimes, I remember, I think that he didn't have a good relationship with Arch Oboler, who was the production chief for that.
Arch Lotterer?
Obel, yeah.
Well, Arch Lotterer was the kind of stage designer,
yes.
The theatre guy. I thought they got on well.
I think they did at the beginning, but by the time the production was ready to put on, Harry did not approve of the dynamic, right? So he wanted to redo it, and he changed some of the libretto and I think some of the music, and he was much more satisfied with the outdoor production that we did in Sausalito. He was happy with it, and it was a good recording. The recording was not done on the stage; it was done in the studio.
Because the wind was blowing away from the bay, right, and half the audience couldn't hear it anyway.
But it was a really effective production. And this is the same Oedipus voice, Alan Lowe, who had done Mills. And Harry was very happy. But, you know, well, that also was by subscription. So that was our second, and that's the only thing I was involved with, is the dances and Oedipus. And keeping the ensemble together, which was difficult because some of the instrumentalists weren't, you know, their time was up, so we had to replace them between dances and Oedipus. And Harry had a difficult time living because until BMI came along, which was total synchronicity, I happened to be going to New York to see my family, and I called up Broadcast Music Inc. I don't know how Harry knew about them, and maybe it was through Lou Harrison or somebody like that. And I called him up, and I got an appointment with the president, Carl Haverland, and I gave him a copy of Plecter and Percussion Dances, and he accepted it, and we had a nice talk. And within days, he called us up, and within 10 days, he flew out to meet Harry and to see the instruments, and he was just fantastic. I mean, he didn't believe that these things existed and that Harry had spent all those years getting to that point. And from then on, Harry got a check every month, I think for the rest of his life. And those checks had nothing to do with the royalties, which BMI usually did. They were a contribution from that company to his existence, and they were a big help. They weren't a great deal of money, actually, but they were enough to keep Harry. Harry was a modest eater. I mean, if you were feeding him, he could take care of quite a lot, but on his own, he didn't eat that much. Sometimes one had to, bring him food. You had the feeling. And later on in his life, I understand that he drank a lot more, but when I knew him, he wasn't drinking that much.
What was life like on the Vallejo? And
well, Vallejo was, he didn't live or inhabit the Vallejo. The Vallejo at that time, and the whole piece of beach there, belonged to Gordon Oslo Ford, and the rear end of the Vallejo was the painter from Greece and Paris, Jean or Janko Varda, and Gordon's place was in the front of the Vallejo, his studio where he painted. Later he allowed Alan Watts to use the front of the Vallejo, but he and his wife Jacqueline were living in quite a wonderful mansion in Mill Valley itself. Later he moved up to Inverness where he lived until he died just a few years ago. He was a neo-surrealist painter, and he was also very into the Zen and Asian study in calligraphy that was very prevalent in San Francisco at the time. And that's what started him on his kind of spiral figures of painting in his work at that time. And Harry admired his work. They got along very well, which was odd because Gordon, was a British baronet, and he was quite reserved and quite formal in his speech, quite unlike anything. Harry had the most American argot, and he practiced it. I think he was so sentimental about his days as a bum and on the road that he kept using that kind of language whenever he could, and it was very engaging. I mean, it made you feel affectionate toward him.
Do you think he played that up a little bit for effect?
No, I don't think so. I think he was a very genuine, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he was the principal. I'm not an American, I was born abroad, He is the epitome of an American talent because he was imbued with our country's history, personalities, and the certain times that he had grown up with. So his departure of taking on the Greek myths was a kind of a reflection of that, because you could see, like in a mirror, the patternings of what his depiction of the myth of U.S. highball, of the bums and their mythic kind of expressions about how they were living and how they were being persecuted by the cops. It's not unlike the Oedipal tragedies or the delusions or the bewitched. It comes out of the same emotional contexts, and he was the most genuine talent because his principles were embedded in, if you want it done right, do it yourself. That was his. He would say that often, and he believed it. Like I said, he would write for 40 pieces of instruments and singers and other necessary, and he was absolutely convinced that he could do each of those pieces better than the person who was doing it. And he would go after each of those pieces until they satisfied him. And he was very friendly about it. He was not an ego in that sense. If you challenged him, his ego would come out. That's not how I am. So he and I never had a falling out in all the years, both when I was with him altogether and later on when I came in and out of his life. We had a genuine friendship which lasted, and I missed him because our lives didn't parallel each other for some of the years before he passed. And I'm so delighted to be back into the rebirth. I was convinced that when he passed that his work would disappear. A few recordings here and there. So 3 sets of instruments to me is inconceivable. And I've seen all 3 of them, and I have nothing but honor for the preservation of the originals here at Montclair, and for John Schneider's set in California, and the Germans. I was born in Germany. I'm a Jew, so I don't have terrific love for Germany, but the German love for culture and their understanding of talent is unparalleled. It just happens that it also parallels a kind of aggressive personality type that we had in our unfortunate experiences with the Hitlerian Nazi period, but it's an extreme. And the positive parts, the Cologne Musikfabrik set of Partch instruments are, to me, an ecstatic expression which honors Harry's existence, and his dedication to a microtonalism, which was not a word that he ever used as far as I'm concerned, because he always used untempered scale and 43 tones. Now, 43 tones was by the time I came around. I know that earlier on there were a lot of other numbers that he assigned to it, but by the time I came around it was 43, and he didn't deviate as far as I know.
Do you think that was just shorthand? Because at some point around that, he said the 43 is just like the 1 half-truth or the 1/4 factor, and it changes up and down, and really corporeality is just as important. Do you think it's just a convenient shorthand?
I think he based it basically on the chromelodion, because that's where he was able to really put the 43 as a basis of, which is very odd considering that the keyboard has nothing to do with that number. But no, he was certain about his principles because he was sure of himself. And I think if you read his background and his parents' missionary existence and his going through the Depression, you understand that his confidence had been established by the fact that he knew that somehow he could survive and he could do what he wanted to do. I didn't read the biography till very late, and it's revealed a lot of things to me that I didn't know about and that he never talked about. But it still shows what a sterling character he had and how he was able to express himself beyond the compass of most people's ability to, make real their ambitions and their understandings of possibility. Because whatever he wanted to do, he made it possible. And he did it with his hands and his mind. I mean, he was a crafts person.
Now, to you, I understand he never discussed his homosexuality.
Never.
Even though it was obvious to other people, and to some people, it was he was an erudite student of ancient Greek and other parts of history. Do you get a sense that he was very careful about how he presented himself to different people?
No, I didn't, to tell you the truth. Like the only incident where it ever came up was this incident that I told you about when Robert Duncan, the poet, brought Kenneth Anger to see Harry, to show him the film Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which had our production of plectrum percussion dances on the optical track, and which Harry threw the projector out the door because he accused Kenneth of doing this without any permission, and Duncan made the mistake of saying, "But Harry, you're one of us." Now, I didn't even quite get what it was, but of course I knew that both Kenneth and Robert were gay, but I had never thought of Harry as gay. I hadn't thought of him as anything sexual because it never came up all the years that we were together. And he wasn't the kind of person who came on with anybody, not in my world. And there were lots of people, so that was the only time that I remember that issue coming up, till much later when there were other people would say, well, Harry in the closet, so he was in the closet. But he never mentioned it, and he certainly was not in any way flourish it, or he was not effeminate. He was very masculine, to tell you the truth, and he made a point of it.
What other artists do you remember him interacting with? Maya Angelou, Lamont
No,
Young,
I mean,
who else was around? Darius Milhaud?
No, he must have known Milhaud. I mean, I knew Brubeck, who was a student of Milhaud's, but I don't know of any interaction that they had. They must have had, because Milhaud was at Mills when Oedipus was there. But Harry liked visual art. He did some sketches himself. He was not innocent of any kind of talent. He could express himself, but he would go to art openings and see things that he liked and things that he didn't like. And musically, he didn't have a great deal of tolerance for music at all, because he had kind of given up classical music when I knew him. He only had a few composers that he was willing to consider friends, both East and West, and there were some people he really disliked a lot in the composition world. I was taken there. I mean, I came to California to go to college, which I never did. After I'd been to Black Mountain, which didn't work out for me because the people I went to study with, M.C. Richards mostly, left in one of their eternal schisms. And I wind up in California, and I'm driven down to Big Sur and up to the ranch. And you know, what is a refugee from Europe growing up in New York think of as a ranch, right? Cowboys and Indians. And here is this guy with short shorts and nothing else, and sunburnt and wild hair. And he says to me, "Hello." I say, "Hello." He said, "I detect a kind of a German background, and you grew up in New York." And I say, "How do you know that?" You know, he says, "I'm a linguist." You know, but here's this guy that looks like a, you know, a primitive, and bearded, and and I got to know him, and he's, you know, all into the American Indians. He is widely read. He has this incredible place on top of a mountain with the Pacific down. I mean, so we became friends, and his family and I became friends, and his friends and I became friends, and I kept on coming back over the years. And then he moved to Berkeley, where his still his wife, they never were divorced. And he was elderly, and I got him to do his Indian Tales on KPFA, and he was a big influence in my life. The third one was Marshall McLuhan. And it's quite a sort of triad, you know.
Were you at Harvard with him?
No, he was never at Harvard. I met him first in Vancouver. We had the first multimedia piece I ever did was at the San Francisco Museum of Art. I had an exhibition there, and the head of the museum gave me 2 nights in the auditorium, and I got this thing together called "Who Are You and What's Happening?" And one of the quotations I used was from something McLuhan had written, which John Cage had lent me. It was a report to the National Association of Educational Broadcasters, which eventually became Understanding Media. And about a week after we had done this thing in San Francisco, I got a call from Vancouver from a man who said, "I was at your," and it was a scandal, this performance. Alfred Frankenstein, who was the big reviewer, wrote a review saying, "Landmark of a flop." So I felt like Stravinsky after The Rites of Spring, you know. And that was great. Anyway, this guy calls me and he says, "I was at your evening. It was really incredible, but I noticed you used a quotation from Marshall McLuhan." I said, "That's true. I got it through John Cage and MC Richards." And he said, "Well, Marshall is coming here to give a lecture, and I wonder if you might come up in 3 weeks and do a performance like you did in San Francisco." So I said, "Why not?" And he said, "If you can bring some of the smaller pieces in your exhibition or other things you have, we'll have a little show of your work, and we'll do the performance, and you'll get to meet McLuhan." So that's what happened. And from then on, we were friends for the rest of his life. You know.
And he didn't consider your work a total flop?
No. I will send you something with his words on it during that, after that performance, where he says something like, you know, I kind of understand why these people relate what I wrote to their work. However, I'm a Victorian. For instance, I don't like pop-up toasters. I like those old toasters where you opened it up and you turned the bread around, and he said, so I write about technology, but I don't really understand it, you know. So that was kind of funny. But yeah, we became great friends. And in Toronto, where he mostly lived. And then there was a period when he was in New York at Fordham University, which turned into a horrible scene. But well, because the funding was from the New York State Legislature, for somehow they had forgotten that he was Canadian, and it was not supposed to be given to anybody except the U.S. So they canceled it in the middle of the year, and Fordham didn't have the money to come up with it. So, but anyway, so McLuhan as a prophet, you know, I revere his work because having from the beginning been fascinated by technology in general, to understand that he got to the basis of the conceptual basis of what technology potential was, and what the different aspects of it could signify, very detailed and very conceptually easy to understand. For instance, the difference between putting your bias into content and putting it into effect. And that meant a lot into our work, because if you thought about the effect that you were having rather than just the content, you had a completely different vision of what the output would be. So there was a lot.
Do you think all of that has become true? Are there things that he wouldn't recognize now in this era of YouTube?
Oh no, he would recognize it all. I mean, he was absolutely explicit and concrete about what his expectations were, and they were 50 to 70 years ahead. Prophecy is very interesting. I mean, biblical prophecy, you can see that it's fairly present. In other words, they were talking about their own time. Now, you get different prophetics who are way ahead of their time, or like Marshall was about 50 to 70 years ahead in terms of it. And we're living in it now. I don't find much prophecy technologically present. We tend to be very critical of our digital dilemma, and there are people writing about that, but I don't see much extension into the next century. It's all kind of hypothetical. You know, there's very little science fiction about the future. The science fiction is more or less about what exists now.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about your own pioneering and prophetic works. And you started the Intermedia Foundation. What's all that about?
Well, Intermedia Foundation, we founded as a not-for-profit in 1968, when we were starting to do, well, we had USCO for a few years, and people were sometimes ready to give us money, but we didn't have any way to take it that makes sense for them, so we wanted a not-for-profit. And I've been president ever since. And we use it basically to perpetuate USCO. USCO was an idea of a collaborative, communal kind of group of people in the arts and in technology and engineering and filmic and photography and video working together. And we started out more or less with 3, and we got up to 15 or 20 people during the years. And we did performances in universities and other institutions all over here and somewhat in Europe. And we also did exhibitions. And for me, it came originally when I was working at KPFA. There was a woman who was into Jung and a lot of other proto-consciousness ideas, and her name was Grace Clements, and I produced some of her talks on KPFA, and she introduced me to the work of Ananda Kumar Swami, who talked about the artist in traditional societies who didn't sign their works and who was part of everything and kind of a normal. And I thought that since we were starting to work together with more than one person, it would be nice to do something on that level. So we used the word USCO, which represented the company of us, and we didn't sign anything, and whatever anybody would do was just called USCO. It worked for a while, you know. I mean, we had a certain amount of people, and they kept on growing, and most of them accepted it. Eventually, we had a friend of a friend who wanted to be a filmmaker, and somebody gave us a camera synchronistically, and we had an idea for making a film, and I gave the camera to, his name was Judd Yorcutt, and he made films which we used in our performances. And after a few years, we were all working together on a film called Turn, 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 which used that music, you know. And it had some of our USCO work in it, and Namjoon Paik's work, and Nicholas Schaffer, and various other light artists. And when he showed us the rough cut, instead of saying USCO, it said Judd Yorcutt for USCO. And the engineer that I've worked with for all those years, originally from the San Francisco Tape Center with Morton Subotnick and Ramon Sender and
Pauline
Oliveras, looked at him and he said, "Judd, I Inc. representing USCO," and Judd was terribly insulted, and we never had the same relationship with him after that. It's a very interesting break, you know, and he died just very, very recently, a few months ago, and I just was at a memorial showing of his at the Filmmakers Co-op in New York, and it was rather disappointing, but you know, it gave us some impression of what the whole commune living together dynamic experience was about, because the positive parts, of course, reflect the negative parts, and there are those. And we had difficulties staying together. Our biggest exhibition was called Down by the Riverside. It was at the Riverside Museum in New York, which no longer exists. And it was quite spectacular. It made the cover of Life again. And there were lines around the block, and it was supposed to be for a month, and it wound up being 3 months, you know. It was kind of a pinnacle. At the same time, we were having financial difficulties, and we did that nightclub, the World on Long Island, the first big multimedia extravaganza for Michael Meyerberg, and that provided us the money to do out of the show, because we did it every weekend, and Michael Callahan had to sit there and play the whole thing.
Was there something John Cage was aware of and interested in, being multimedia, or not his bag?
No, Uncle John was pretty much into his own thing. I mean, he was conscious of the fact that we had gotten into McLuhan through him, and he was, but, you know, he had a lifestyle which was pretty focused. He loved playing poker. I did not play poker, and I still don't, and he resented that because they were always trying to get together. Is it 4 people? Whatever. And they were missing one, and I couldn't fill in, you know. So, you know, he was very conscious of the fact that I had worked with Harry, and he considered that not, I mean, he really had no use for Harry's ideas, you know. I couldn't understand it because he was an intelligent person, and he understood the difference between tempered and untempered, and it makes perfect sense that both of them can coexist very nicely, but he wasn't willing to give it room. So I didn't enjoy, I mean, like I said, I used to give him rides to the city. I told you the story about Lamont Young, and I told him that I was going, I didn't ask him where he was going, where, I wouldn't do that. It's going to spoil your hearing. You'll never be able to hear again. It's totally untrue. It's a captious kind of a thing. Of course, you know, then the whole, you know, I think part of the thing with John and Harry was John was quite vociferous about being gay. I think he didn't like the fact that Harry was in the closet. It may have been part of the origin of their disallegiance with each other, although Harry really thought that John was out of it, you know, the whole idea of, I tried to get, I can't remember when Silence came out.
66-ish?
Yeah. So he could have read it, but I don't think he did.
There was some back and forth when John was putting together notations and wanted a quote from Harry. Harry sent it along. John edited it down to 43 words, as though it were a mesostic, or the number 43 was somehow mystical, and Harry blew a gasket.
Really? I
Said,
don't.
how dare you use the number 43? Of course your editing is fine, but the 43 is the one half truth or the one fourth factor. You have been cursed by me before, but you have been cursed before, but never by me. And if you are cursed by me, there will be a difference.
Is there? That's in the book?
Yes.
Oh my God! I don't remember it. Wow, that's wild. That is really wild.
Do you think in the film The Dreamer That Remains, Harry talks about the role of the artist, and in Primitive Man, take the example of Primitive Man and the cave paintings, for instance, Alaska. Who knows who made those? And by implication, he's saying that here are the instruments, here's my music. Who cares about whether Harry Partch's name is associated with it? Do you think he was aware of USCO in that sense?
No, USCO, I don't think he was aware of USCO, but he was aware of the fact that I had read and talked to him about Ananda Coomaraswamy and the idea of the traditional artist's role, yes, right. And he liked it. Because, you know, if you would tell him how great it was that he was able to build all the instruments and put things together with his own hands, he would kind of, oh, it's like a big deal, you know. He didn't take it very seriously, except when he was doing it, he took it totally seriously, you know. And he knew how to take care of tools. He liked fine tools. He didn't, you know. And he liked hand tools. He only used machine tools when they were necessary. He would much rather use a drill that you had to turn than an electric drill. You know, it's a period. He was a period piece, you know, because, I mean, look, I'm 85 now, so he was a young man when he learned what he was able to do and what he continued to do, and the whole mythology that he created about himself, it doesn't match his biography. Like I said, he told me over and over again that he was born in China. Now, why would he say he was born in China when he obviously knew he was born in Oakland?
Some kind of metaphorical wish, perhaps.
Yeah, something like that. And he was quite verbose about his missionary parents. And I got the impression from the biography that was a lot more plus minus than he painted it to be. That they weren't necessarily lifelong convinced as missionaries. You know.
Well, I think also in the 50s he at least began to reawaken a hatred in his mother and the religion for the whole circumcision thing that took him by surprise when his father had gone out of town and mother at the age of 8 or 9 or whatever it was.
That's a horrible story.
Yeah.
Yes, it is a horrible story, yes. I couldn't believe it when I read it, because I had no idea. You know, he never talked about personal things like that.
Yeah, and Lou Harrison mentioned that Harry had no balls, but I don't know that there's any indication that he talked about that to anyone else or what that condition might have been.
Orchidectomy, I think it's called, isn't it? I don't know. But, yeah, he must have had a very sad feeling about his gender identity, but he didn't show it. And, you know, Gordon and he were very friendly, for instance, you know, and it's a very odd relationship because Gordon had that aristocratic persona, and Harry was able to have a peer relationship with that, with a lot of people, a lot of people couldn't manage it because Harry took himself totally seriously, you know, and Gordon really respected it. He was a big. I mean, if it hadn't been for Gordon, I would never have come across Harry. But I think he did a lot for Harry all across the board, and he was outraged by that scene with Anne Halpern because they were also friends.
And just touch on some of the other people that were around then, like Mata. Did you know Mata, the painter from Chile?
But not in my time. No. Yes. I don't think Mata was in San Francisco at that time. Was he?
Yeah, I've got a picture of them having dinner together in 1955.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
At a Chinese restaurant with Gordon and Jackie. But Maya Angelou, Odetta, anyone else around there that had interesting interactions? Martha Graham?
He knew Martha, and I didn't know her, but someone who was very close to Martha, Abbott Fraser, who was also gay and lived in Oregon, and he had known Harry and Martha together. Oh, that's funny. No, I don't remember Mata. I knew who he was, but I don't remember him in San Francisco. But a lot of people passed through San Francisco in those days. It was I don't. What year? What year did we do Oedipus?
1954 was the second performance in Sausalito on Shell Beach.
54.
Yeah.
So, and you say the Mata photograph was when? Also in the 50s?
About 1955, shortly before he went to Illinois for Bewitched in 1956.
Okay, yeah. See, I had left. I left after Oedipus, and I came back. No, wait a minute. No, I was still out there. I hitchhiked to Illinois for the Bewitched. 55, you say?
56.
56.
It was when he was there. Then 57 and 59. It was done in Columbia. Oh, 58 maybe at Columbia.
I wasn't at Columbia. I was in
Illinois. 56. Yeah.
56. Yeah, it was a great performance.
Well, that was the controversial one with Alwyn Nicolai, of course.
Yes.
Started so promisingly with Ben introducing them, Ben Johnston, and then all of a sudden it goes dark and vitriolic.
Yeah, well, I think it was the same thing that happened in Mills. Eventually, at the very end, he and Oboler didn't get along. I think it was a pattern. If he needed to be in control, and when somebody else insisted, it flipped him out. And see, that's the nice thing about Sausalito. It was his whole production, you know. And I'm very flexible. I always backed off, you know. And he didn't give a shit about what Gate 5 or the subscriptions. All he wanted was the answer. He didn't want the process, you know. And that's kind of what service is about. I mean, if you're going to help somebody, you don't want to make them do the work, right? And I didn't want Harry to get involved. You know, I wanted him to do what he did best. And so we had a great relationship, but the other people didn't. You know, and Fred is the same way, Fred Lyon. He comes and he disappears. You know, he's not one of those photographers who take over.
What about Rob Kafka? Did you meet him?
No.
I think he did one of the early designs for the Gate 5 albums.
No.
And then he was in Chicago. He introduced Harry to Madeline.
Rob?
Yeah, Rob Kostka, Kostka.
No, he didn't do
Yeah,
he didn't do the albums for
Not for the first one, no.
well, and not for Oedipus.
No.
No.
No, that's some of the way.
So what
He was based in Chicago, and
yeah, but the later albums were not that just used Gate 5. He was no longer at Gate 5.
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
He liked the idea of Gate 5, and it's a great idea because, you know, it kind of infused a practically biblical thing. And I worked on in Israel on Beth Hatufasah, which is the house of the diaspora, and we divided it into gates, sharim in Hebrew, the gates of the experience of the Jewish people through the centuries. It's funny, I never connected that with Gate 5. I mean, the Hebrew thing was much later. Yeah.
Did Harry ever talk about his old friends from the 30s who had helped him, like Mildred Cooper,
No.
who was a Santa Barbara microtonal composer and
Yes.
the fairy godmother of his chromelodeon?
Right.
Rudolphine Radil.
No, I read about all that, but no, he did not. He was very present, you know. There wasn't a lot of past that came out of him. I mean, he was very imbued in what he had to do today and the next few days, and the production and performance were his whole life. Yeah. See, he didn't have any real relationships. He had friends, or he had somebody like me who did what was needed to do, and that's what Dan Lee did later. I mean, Dan Lee was very good, you know, no doubt about that. Having gotten so much older, I think there's been a lot of difficulties with Dan Lee, but you know, I don't know him anymore, so I'm hypothecating. You know, I got the feeling that, for instance, when he wrote about the Musikfabrik delusions, a very grumpy kind of approach. I don't think it reflects Harry's tendencies. You know, Harry's respect for people's creativity was above his need to have everything be himself. I never thought of Harry, and I've known a lot of people who are big egos, you know. I never thought of Harry as being egoistic. There are people who did feel that way about him. But he knew what he was doing. How many people know what they're doing? You know, I mean, who have incredible, unique ideas? I mean, who in music would think of going back to the monochord? I mean, I never even heard of a monochord until he brought it up, but I understood immediately why it was a basic phenomenon in sound. I was into sound long before Harry.
What do you think the takeaway from Harry Partch is in a nutshell? If a student comes across Harry Partch for the first time and knows either the list of specifics about 43, what you can do with your body, with tuning, or building your own instruments, should they go ahead and explore some of those angles, or is it more, as Harry himself said, this is what I did, now go and do your own goddamn thing?
Yeah, that's what I think. I mean, but the realization that somebody can come up with a whole world of an artistic discipline based on historic principles based on real scientific facts and constitute a body of work like somebody did, I think is a tremendous inspiration for young artists and young musicians and young people altogether. I mean, it's more than learning a language. You can learn to think outside of the box, because he didn't have any boxes. He built boxes, and put things into them. But, I mean, you start out with a string, and you start out with a percussive surface, and all of a sudden you've got what you have in that room downstairs. I mean, there's nothing like it. And so and John Cage comes up with silence. It's, and I honor that word from him, and I honor the book that he wrote about it. It's a very perceptive book. One of my favorite parts is when he goes to Japan and they say, "We know you're into mushrooms. Would you like to see something?" He said, "Oh, I'd love to see those mushrooms I've heard about." And a few days later, they take him up the mountain, Mount Fuji, and there's all these mushrooms that he's never heard of. He can't believe it. He's absolutely ecstatic. And that evening, he goes to dinner with a Japanese friend of his. He tells him the story, and the guy says, "They went all over Japan and brought those mushrooms to show you in Mount Fuji. None of those mushrooms exist on Mount Fuji." That's life, But Harry didn't need that. It was all out of his own head and out of his reading. I mean, he read exhaustively, and he had a very good memory. Now, there's one thing, for instance. Harry says to me, focus, the Greek word focus, which is with a K, focus was the narrow pass where 3 roads met, and Oedipus met and killed his father. You look on the internet, you look on Google, you look wherever you want to. You don't find that. Do I believe Harry? Yes, I believe Harry.
I thought it meant the focus was the hearth of the fireplace, where people gather.
No, he says focus was the narrow pass where 3 roads met, was the name of the narrow pass. Now, why do I believe him when I can't validate it? Because I believe Harry. He was someone who one had faith about. That when he spoke, it was the truth. Maybe it was his. Maybe he made it up. It makes perfect sense, though, doesn't it? 3 paths, focus.
Gerd Stern, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad we got a chance to meet. It puts me back into focus.